History knows her as Empress Matilda. He understood she was probably born on February 7, 1102 in Sutton Courtenay, located in Berkshire in southern England. Her father was King Henry III of England. He was the youngest son of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who in 1066 had commanded an army across the English Channel, initiating the conquest of England from the Anglo-Saxons and Danes. He had asserted his claim to the throne after the demise of his brother, King William II, also called William Rufus, a couple of years prior to Matilda's birth. The former king met his end in a hunting mishap that some considered questionable. He knew Matilda received her name in honor of her mother, Matilda of Scotland, a daughter born to King Malcolm III of Scotland, and his wife, the Anglo-Saxon royal princess, Margaret of Wessex. He could see that this ancestry meant Matilda was descended from the Norman kings of England, the Dukes of Normandy, the kings of Scotland, and furthermore the ancient Anglo-Saxon rulers of England before the Norman conquest. He understood she was merely one of two children produced by Henry and Matilda's union. The other was a male child, William Adelin, whose birth occurred a year and a half after Matilda's. Being a male child, William automatically became heir to the throne upon his birth. But he knew that if anything were to befall him, Matilda would then stand as Henry's heir. Although he recognized this presented challenges during an era when leaders were primarily expected to be military commanders. Henry also fathered more than 20 children by his mistresses, yet these were illegitimate and thus barred from succeeding him. He understood Matilda entered a political landscape in Western Europe far more intricate than the modern one. He knew the region's fragmented character would influence her entire life. He observed that Matilda's father governed England, which even then constituted a fairly centralized, unified kingdom, exercising increasing sway over the Welsh lords to the west and, at least momentarily, maintaining reasonably favorable relations with Scotland due to Henry's marriage to Matilda's mother, who held the status of a Scottish princess. He recognized the situation grew far more intricate across the English Channel. In this area, Henry and his broader kin held sway over the Duchy of Normandy in the north, concurrently extending influence over various other territories like the County of Blois via marital agreements. A king of France resided here, governing from Paris, yet he commanded no dominion even remotely resembling the present-day French nation-state, notwithstanding that lords such as the Dukes of Normandy and the Lords of Anjou were technically subordinates of the French king and owed him feudal allegiance. Eastward, he saw that Germany remained similarly fragmented into scores of duchies, counties, and principalities, though akin to France, a degree of centralized authority existed in the form of the Holy Roman Emperors. At the moment of Matilda's birth, Emperor Henry IV held the position of the reigning Holy Roman Emperor, although starting from 1098 he had commenced governing in collaboration with his son and designated heir, the prospective Emperor Henry IV. Although he understood it might have appeared a faraway land to her during her childhood, he knew occurrences in Germany would significantly affect Matilda's life from a remarkably early stage. He noted that numerous English chroniclers, such as William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, lived at the same time as Matilda and composed extensive writings about her life and her assertions to the English throne. A small number of these offered favorable portrayals, yet the greater part presented a detrimental image of her, particularly the Gestas Stephani, translated as the Acts of Stephen, a writing that, quite predictably given its title, offered a biased narrative supporting the claims Matilda's cousin Stephen held to the English throne. Regrettably, he understood a biographical account of Matilda's life penned by the French bishop and chronicler Arnulf of Lisieux, vanished during the late medieval era, a document that would have provided additional insight into her life, personality, and periods of rule in Germany, France, and England. He was also aware of numerous histories and analyses of Matilda's claims to the English throne, authored by Tudor historians in the 16th century, an epoch where the swift successions of Queen Mary the Empress and Queen Elizabeth Empress in 1503 and 1558 spurred Englishmen to re-examine the history, advantages, and character of female rule. He found these chronicles offered an incomplete depiction of Matilda's early years. He understood she spent her childhood amidst a traveling court that frequently journeyed between England and northern France, with her father and mother dwelling for stretches of time at Westminster close to London or at Rouen in Normandy. He saw it was a substantial court composed of lords from both England and France, where French served as the common language. Despite having only one full brother, He noted Matilda was raised within a sizable company of nearly 24 illegitimate half-siblings and many first cousins, including the offspring of her father's sister Adela, Countess of Blois. He believed she might have gained some schooling and instruction from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, recognized as one of the most scholarly figures in Christendom then, before his passing in 1109. He assumed other monks and bishops would also have provided tutoring to the royal court's children during a period when educational levels in Europe were undergoing a considerable phase of expansion, prompting modern historians to refer to a 12th century Renaissance that preceded the 15th century Italian Renaissance. He observed that despite her remarkably youthful age, Matilda's father consented to his daughter's betrothal to the emperor, and subsequently, she was brought up over the following 4 years in Western Germany to help her adjust to German culture and the language of the populace she would one day rule as empress. Even judging by the norms of medieval Europe, he considered the choice to conduct a wedding ceremony in January 1114 in the city of Worms when Matilda was still some weeks away from her 12th birthday, while Henry III was no younger than his late 20s and possibly up to 33 years of age, to be out of the ordinary. He knew marriage rites were usually not performed until individuals had reached at least 13 or 14 and were regarded as transitioning into their early adult period according to the customs of the time. He noted Matilda would spend slightly more than 10 years as the Holy Roman Empress, the most prominent royal female in Germany. He recognized it was a turbulent era in the empire's history, as her husband was essentially engaged in conflict with the papacy in Rome over mastery of northern Italy, a considerable segment of the Holy Roman Empire then. Henry V had even faced excommunication with the Pope's endorsement in 1112, 2 years prior to taking Matilda as his wife. He saw that in the initial years following the marriage, Henry devoted a significant portion of his time to military campaigns southward into the plain of Lombardy, and after a while Matilda accompanied him there with her retinue and domestic personnel. Even at one juncture in 1117, moving south towards Rome itself, as the emperor sought to capture the Eternal City. Intriguingly, he noted that despite her youth, Matilda was participating actively in political matters by 1116 and 1117, with indications suggesting she attended governmental councils and served as an informal advocate for political initiatives brought before the imperial court. In 1117, he also understood she asserted her claim to the title of Holy Roman Empress once Henry emerged triumphant from the military engagements in Italy. Yet he knew the title did not receive the official approval of Pope Paschal II, and whether she possessed the legal right to style herself empress or merely held the lesser imperial title of Queen of the Romans became a subject of dispute for many years thereafter. He saw that Matilda steadfastly insisted on being known as Empress Matilda, continuing this practice long after departing Germany. He noted in 1118, Matilda's prominence within her husband's administration became evident when he himself went back to Germany to suppress increasing disquiet among several feudal lords there, and entrusted Matilda with overseeing the imperial governance south of the Alps during his absence. He understood she fulfilled significant duties over the ensuing years, particularly in bringing the investiture's controversy to a close, a protracted disagreement between consecutive Holy Roman emperors and popes since 1076 concerning whether the emperor held the authority to appoint archbishops and bishops in the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, or if the pope possessed the ultimate say in formally granting authority to these church officials. He understood the controversy was ultimately settled by the Concordat of Worms, formalized in 1122 within the German city sharing its name. He recognized Matilda undertook an unofficial diplomatic capacity in achieving a substantial agreement that allocated distinct roles to the emperors and the popes concerning the investiture of bishops throughout the empire. He knew the course of Matilda's life fundamentally shifted due to the events of November 25, 1120. That night, he learned Matilda's brother and the designated heir to the English throne, William Adelin, embarked with a considerable group of nobles and courtiers to journey by sea from Barfleur in Normandy across the Channel towards England. Alongside William Adelin, he was aware that several of the king's illegitimate offspring were aboard, though Henry himself was absent, having already arranged his own travel plans for the return voyage to England. He understood the company was believed to have consumed a considerable amount of drink before embarking on the ship named the White Ship, under the command of a certain Thomas Fitzstephen. It did not progress far. Shortly after entering the harbor of Barfleur, The vessel collided with a submerged rock protruding from the seabed and quickly commenced sinking. He learned that out of approximately 300 individuals aboard, it is reported that only a single person survived. He noted among the deceased was William Adelin, and with his brother's passing, he understood the succession was plunged into utter confusion, since the king's sole legitimate male heir was now gone. He realized Matilda would consequently become central to the discussions regarding her father's succession. He knew the White Ship incident would ultimately culminate in civil conflict in the period known as the Anarchy in England and Normandy, as the legitimacy of Matilda's position in the line of succession came under scrutiny. He saw that in the direct aftermath of the White Ship calamity, political upheaval gripped England and northern France. Henry had suffered the loss of his only legitimate son and the clear successor to his territories. At that point, he noted only Matilda remained among his children as a legitimate offspring born within marriage, thereby presenting herself as a potential successor. He considered that many might have assumed at this critical juncture that Henry would seek a new heir beyond his immediate kin. He identified two possible candidates, his nephews, the sons of his sister Adela, namely Theobald, Count of Blois, and his younger sibling Stephen. He thought the latter could have been regarded as a particularly probable successor. He understood that despite her father's endeavors to solidify her standing as his successor, Matilda received acceptance from only a fraction of the influential individuals, the knights and lords of England and northern France, and the leading church officials of the English clergy. He knew that upon Henry's death and the need for a successor to be crowned, whether Matilda ascended to queen depended entirely on the readiness of these men to respect the king's desires. He noted many were unwilling. Although England would welcome female sovereigns in later centuries, he observed the concept of a female monarch was viewed as challenging during an era when a ruler's chief responsibility involved guiding their feudal lords into combat. He knew this situation also prevailed in France, where customary law stipulated that the role of a queen regnant was disallowed, permitting instead only a queen consort married to a reigning king. Conscious of these difficulties, he understood Henry would convene his lords frequently throughout the 1120s and into the early 1130s, compelling them to take formal vows to support his succession arrangements. As an alternative measure, he also entered into a second marriage, wedding Adeliza of Louvain in 1121. This union, however, he found to be even less fruitful than his initial one concerning the generation of legitimate offspring. No children resulted from it, and Matilda thus remained Henry's sole legally eligible heir. He recognized another challenge presented by Matilda's potential succession was her status as an absentee heir. He recalled that back in 1114, she had married the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V. While he understood this represented a politically significant alliance with one of the foremost powers in Europe at that time, it simultaneously meant she resided in Germany and other areas of Central Europe during the early 1120s. Even as Henry exerted himself trying to persuade his lords to acknowledge her as his successor, he knew that in an era preceding any kind of mass communication, like printing, maintaining a physical presence within one's territories held immense importance. He understood this was the reason monarchs routinely undertook travels throughout their realms, to be seen in person and reinforce their authority among their subjects. He saw Matilda's absence in Germany compounded the difficulty due to this factor. He considered that ultimately, the lords of England possessed no real understanding of the individual to whom they were being requested to pledge allegiance in the early 1120s. He mused that perhaps Matilda was a formidable, composed woman capable of becoming a capable ruler in the future. Conversely, he thought she might have been entirely contrary to this description, a person lacking resolve and significance, one who could not command respect as a prospective heir. He concluded the crux of the matter was that no one could be certain, and this circumstance rendered Henry's objective considerably more challenging. He observed that in the end, the English king's son-in-law, Emperor Henry V, inadvertently solved this predicament by passing away prematurely in May 1125 from a type of cancer while conducting military operations in the Low Countries. He knew that he and Matilda had produced no surviving offspring, although, as previously mentioned, a child had been born years earlier but succumbed in infancy. He noted the imperial title consequently transferred to Lothair of Supplenburg, Duke of Saxony. Released from her marital commitments and with no children or relatives binding her to Germany, he saw Matilda made her way back to England in 1126. He understood that there, her father's knights and lords would have formed their initial lasting impression of the woman Henry intended to govern them eventually. He thought they ought to have felt somewhat reassured. He saw Matilda as a poised, competent woman, one who perhaps lacked the capacity to command them in battle in the customary manner, but who many might have considered capable of serving as an effective queen. Nevertheless, he knew others remained utterly unconvinced regarding the feasibility of a female sovereign, and a further segment felt disillusioned more generally by the substantial taxation the king was levying, which intensified their opposition to his succession schemes. Following a period in England, he noted Matilda traverse the English Channel and settled in Normandy. He saw she persisted in styling herself as Empress Matilda there, notwithstanding her husband the emperor's death in 1125, a practice that later chroniclers and historians readily adopted, and Matilda is still recognized in historical records as Empress Matilda today. He noted her father quickly arranged another marriage for her in France. On this occasion, the intended husband was Geoffrey Plantagenet, the son and successor of the Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine. He understood the counties of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine constituted significant feudal domains situated south of Normandy, north of the county of Poitou, and west of Paris. They encompassed a considerable section of north-central France, and consequently he saw Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey was, superficially at least, a shrewd maneuver designed to guarantee Matilda financial and military support should she need to contend for her crown after Henry's passing. Yet, he recognized the marriage presented difficulties in other aspects. He noted Geoffrey remained 10 weeks shy of his 15th birthday when their wedding took place on June 17, 1128, and upon succeeding as Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine the subsequent year, he rapidly gained a reputation for severity, which provoked hostility among some of the less significant lords of Normandy to the north. He saw this estranged additional potential allies for Matilda, although ultimately the assets Anjou could contribute after Henry's death proved vital in sustaining Matilda's aspirations to claim the throne. He considered the late 1120s and early 1130s a challenging period for Matilda. He attributed a significant portion of this difficulty to the persistent problems regarding the succession. He noted by this time, Matilda's first cousin, Stephen of Blois, was becoming distinctly visible as a competitor. He recalled that back in 1125, around the time Matilda's first husband passed away, and she commenced preparations for her return to England, Stephen had wed Matilda of Boulogne, who had just inherited the title of Countess of Boulogne. He saw this rendered Stephen the lord of one of the leading political entities in northern France, situated directly on the English Channel coast, in addition to possessing further properties in Kent and southeastern England, thereby bolstering his position. Concurrently, he learned Matilda's marriage was experiencing difficulties, and within a year of its occurrence, Matilda resolved to depart Anjou and take up residence in Normandy. He noted a reconciliation was achieved in 1131, yet the whole affair had displeased Matilda's father, who held the view that she was permitting her personal sentiments to impede the requirement for establishing a permanent political resolution to the succession dilemma. He observed that the final years of Henry's life saw a gradual deterioration in the rapport between the king and his daughter, although he never signaled any alteration in his stance regarding the succession. He believed Henry's unwavering resolve to ensure Matilda succeeded him possibly stemmed from the occurrences of 1133. That spring, he learned Matilda welcomed her first child into the world, providing solace after her extended and largely childless union with Emperor Henry IV and several years married to Geoffrey, also without producing an heir. He noted the boy, born on March 5, 1133 at Le Mans, received the name Henry from his parents in honor of his grandfather, the king, serving as a clear declaration to Matilda's father and the wider political sphere that Matilda now possessed her own heir, and should she indeed become queen following her father, it would function as a temporary rule of sorts, paving the way for the future ascension of another King Henry in time. He saw the king was overjoyed, and the birth prompted him to journey to Normandy to visit his grandchild. He observed a reconciliation appeared to have been established between him and Matilda. However, he noted it proved temporary. A year afterward, Matilda bore another son, this one named Geoffrey. He understood the delivery was arduous, and it seemed at one point Matilda might not survive, precipitating a fresh disagreement with her father concerning the provisions of Matilda's own will and the location she desired for her interment. Hence, he saw the restored good relations between father and daughter were not enduring. He learned Matilda's father passed away on December 1st, 1135, while in Normandy. Despite being approximately 67 years old then, he had been conducting military action in northern France against a revolt by some Norman lords when he died. Although he noted the king had never wavered in backing Matilda as his successor, his daughter and son-in-law were providing some assistance to the rebellious lords at the moment of Henry's death. He heard rumors that the king's demise was caused by consuming an excessive number of lampreys, a type of fish. He considered that perhaps some form of food poisoning played a role, though he also acknowledged his death at such an advanced age could just as plausibly have resulted from natural causes. As intelligence spread, he saw it became clear that not all of Henry's lords and knights planned to uphold Matilda's bid to succeed him. Instead, many promptly began plotting. He noted Stephen of Blois, Matilda's first cousin, rapidly took the initiative. He learned that within a week of the king's death, he had reached England and was soliciting backing from prominent church figures and nobles. Subsequently, he secured the public recognition of London's populace and was ultimately crowned as King Stephen I at Westminster Abbey on December 22, 1135, merely 3 weeks following Henry's passing. He observed Stephen had successfully secured the crown, defying Henry III's desires. Largely owing to advantageous timing and location, he knew that as reports of the aged king's death started to circulate, Stephen was situated not far from Normandy and Boulogne, making him ideally positioned for a rapid crossing to England. He noted the same could not be stated for his brother, Theobald of Blois, another potential claimant to the throne. Similarly, he saw Matilda was further south in Anjou and had scarcely any opportunity to respond before intelligence arrived, announcing Stephen's coronation at Westminster in England. He identified another factor limiting Matilda's capacity to hinder Stephen's seizure of the crown. She was once again pregnant when her father died and would deliver her third and last son, William, in mid-1136. He noted each of her sons, Henry, Geoffrey, and William, would be recognized by contemporaries and throughout ensuing centuries by the appellations Henry Fitz-Empress, Geoffrey Fitz-Empress, and William Fitz-Empress, with Fitz signifying son of and Empress, referencing Matilda's choice to persist in utilizing this title long after the passing of her initial spouse. He understood Matilda and Geoffrey did not instantly initiate a conflict with Stephen to attempt to reclaim the throne on Matilda's behalf. He recognized they were simply not adequately positioned in terms of strength. Instead, he noted they chose to delay for a few years, gradually accumulating allies and making military and financial preparations for the impending war. He concluded that the catalyst for their action and the event that precipitated the outbreak of the civil conflict known as the Anarchy occurred when numerous influential lords in England indicated their backing for Matilda's claim and their opposition to Stephen in 1137 and 1138. He identified the most notable supporter as Robert of Gloucester, an illegitimate half-brother of Matilda's, whom Henry III had elevated to the rank of earl and granted considerable estates in England. He knew that from the moment Stephen first reached England in December 1135, he had demonstrated his unwillingness to acknowledge his cousin as the new sovereign, making efforts to obstruct his coronation. He understood the anarchy commenced when Robert of Gloucester initiated a rebellion in 1138. The subsequent year, he learned Matilda arrived in England leading a force from France. Over the following years, he saw the conflict intensify, with Matilda, Geoffrey, Gloucester, and their other confederates securing a large portion of the West Midlands and West Country for Matilda's faction and establishing the port of Bristol as their operational headquarters, while Stephen maintained authority over London, the adjacent home counties, and East Anglia. He noted the majority of the hostilities during the anarchy would unfold in the Midlands and districts such as Oxfordshire, situated between Bristol and London. He saw Stephen, who received a significantly more sympathetic depiction from chroniclers such as William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, was scarcely English himself, having been born in France, originating from Blois, and holding the title of Count of Boulogne in northern France before taking the English throne. He noted conversely, he had resided in England for durations since the mid-1110s and possessed substantial landholdings there, while Matilda, despite her English birth, had consistently been a remote presence in Germany, Italy, and France. He felt Stephen also seemed to possess greater humility, whereas he observed English commentators went to lengths to emphasize Matilda's haughty and frequently imperious character, a trait that caused one author to describe her, even in her later life, as having a tyrannical inclination. He concluded all of this was demonstrated by her persistence in being addressed as Empress Matilda. He considered the most undeniably significant occurrences of the Anarchy, excluding those that eventually concluded it years afterward, took place in 1141. Early that year, he noted Stephen was conducting a siege of Lincoln Castle when Robert of Gloucester advanced with several hundred knights and a considerable body of Welsh allies to lift the siege. He saw the Battle of Lincoln commenced on February 2, 1141, subsequent to Gloucester and his troops' arrival. It represented a conclusive defeat for Stephen, during which many of his Confederates deserted him under the pressure exerted by Gloucester's forces. He noted Stephen and his personal retinue became encircled within the chaos, and despite their attempts to fight their way free, Stephen was apprehended by Gloucester's forces. Now held captive, he was transported westward towards Bristol, where he learned Matilda commanded his incarceration within Bristol Castle. He felt this astonishing triumph left Matilda appearing victorious, though he knew Stephen's objective was not vanquished. He saw that no sooner had news of the king's apprehension reached London and Westminster than his wife, also named Matilda, somewhat confusingly, commenced assembling troops to retaliate against the Empress and maintain the vitality of Stephen's faction. He understood the short conflict between the two Matildas that ensued would shortly result in another significant alteration in the military and political environment. He knew all of that still lay in the months to come. In the immediate future, he saw Matilda had achieved a considerable victory over Stephen and held her primary opponent captive. He noted she now proceeded to assert her birthright and execute her father's desires for the succession by assuming control as England's ruler. And yet he found there was a peculiar detail regarding this. He noted that although Matilda commonly employed the title of Empress and was now seeking to become queen, she did not assume either of these designations, opting instead to issue royal charters and grants under the title of Domina Anglorum, signifying Lady of the English. In early April, he saw she and her adherents, accompanied by certain prominent figures from the English clergy whom she had persuaded to support her faction, reached Winchester, the location of one of Europe's most magnificent Gothic cathedrals and a highly significant hub of the medieval English church. There he learned Matilda was made queen in an improvised ceremony. Nevertheless, he noted a subsequent endeavor to attempt to capture London proved unsuccessful, and Matilda obtained neither the public endorsement of the capital's populace, nor was she crowned at Westminster. He noted this occurred despite her securing the allegiance of Geoffrey de Manville, who held authority over the Tower of London at that time. Yet when Matilda proceeded to attempt entry into London, he saw the residents made their definite reluctance to permit her access known. He found it somewhat surprising that she did indeed possess the assent of Stephen himself, who instructed some of his adherents to concur with Matilda's coronation, possibly out of apprehension that he might be killed at Bristol if he refused. Regardless, he observed numerous individuals persisted in regarding Matilda's coronation as wholly without legitimacy. On the 14th of September, they descended upon Winchester and thoroughly defeated the forces assembled there to support Matilda. The rout of Winchester held significance as Robert of Gloucester was also captured during the combat. With his foremost ally and half-brother now held captive by Stephen's wife and his Confederates, Matilda found herself with no choice but to arrange for Stephen's release from Bristol. Thus, merely a little over 6 months after vanquishing Stephen at Lincoln, taking him captive, and being hailed as Lady of the English, Matilda was compelled to free her cousin. The Civil War subsequently reverted to being as intensely disputed an affair as it had ever been. Since Matilda did not relinquish the title she had taken on in April 1141, historians of the period typically consider that there were effectively two monarchs of England, crowned in different manners, King Stephen and Queen Matilda. This state of affairs persisted throughout the 1140s. Matilda was present there in 1141 when some of Stephen's troops arrived. They seemingly were unaware that Matilda was at Devizes. Nonetheless, any attempt by him to try and flee would have inevitably led to his detection. Consequently, he resolved to slip out covertly by disguising himself in burial attire and then being secured onto a funeral bier. His attendants then conveyed him out of Devizes as though they were removing a deceased body. Apparently, Matilda remained in his prone and bound posture for numerous hours until the company had completely exited the territory where Stephen's forces were raiding and reached the safety of Gloucester. Later, his forces retook Devizes, and he would compensate the inhabitants for their assistance in facilitating his escape, granting them a royal charter to hold markets as a small borough town. A second close call took place in 1142. Following the rout of Winchester and the freeing of Stephen and Robert of Gloucester, the conflict in 1142 started concentrating on Oxford. Stephen became aware that Matilda had relocated his government there by that time and reached the conclusion that capturing him would deliver a decisive blow and terminate the war. Therefore, in the autumn, he advanced upon Oxford, the location of an impressive castle in a town that had already emerged as a center of higher learning. Caught off guard by the advance of Stephen's forces, Matilda and his adherents found themselves trapped inside Oxford Castle as a siege commenced from September 1142 onward. By winter, more than 2.5 months into the siege, conditions within were severe. With Matilda and the others facing shortages of all types of supplies, Stephen's scheme to capture him was, however, thwarted. In December, the Lady of the English and a small number of close followers broke out of Oxford Castle and avoided discovery by Stephen's troops to make their way back west towards Bristol. There exist differing accounts of how he accomplished his escape. One version has Matilda simply departing through a postern or rear gate of the castle. Another narrative, a more romantic but not implausible one, asserted that Matilda and his allies slid down a rope from a castle window to safety and then made their getaway dressed entirely in white to blend in with the snow that had covered Oxfordshire that December. Whichever tale is accurate, we are certain that Matilda achieved yet another narrow escape and persisted in fighting against Stephen into the mid-1140s. While the conflict had undergone numerous shifts and turns in England during 1141 and 1142, circumstances were more definitive in northern France. Here, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had invaded Normandy and largely secured control of the duchy for her cause in the early 1140s. Normandy would remain primarily under Angevin dominion for the remainder of the war, with Geoffrey effectively incorporating Normandy into the counties of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine to become a French noble who could challenge the King of France in terms of the extent of his territories and influence. By this point, the opposing sides of the war had clearly defined themselves. France was lost to the Angevins, whereas in England, Matilda controlled the West Country, West Midlands, and part of the northwest of England, while Stephen commanded a strong base of support in the south. The home counties surrounding London, extending north to East Anglia, and further north again towards York. The Midlands served as the front lines, although the anarchy, as contemporary chronicles emphatically attest, was causing ruin throughout England as local lords and knights exploited the disorder and the weakening of royal authority as a chance to expand their own landholdings and enrich themselves. The mid-1140s marked a phase of relative inactivity in the Civil War compared to the dramatic events of 1141 and 1142. Firstly, the two factions became evenly matched and consolidated their authority over various areas of England. Subsequently, occurrences far to the east conspired to restrict the scale of the conflict. In 1144, the county of Edessa, one of the four principal Christian Crusader states founded in the Levant as part of the First Crusade half a century prior, was captured by a Syrian Muslim military leader named Zengi. When reports of these developments reached Western Europe, a new crusade was preached and garnered immense support. The King of France, Louis VII, was among those who took the cross and headed for the Holy Land. With their liege lord committed to the Second Crusade, many French nobles, who formed the core of Matilda's support in the civil war with Stephen, agreed to journey east as well, although some were ultimately diverted to Iberia, where Lisbon was conquered for the Christian cause in 1147. Adding to the difficulties, several of Matilda's other allies perished during the mid-1140s, including Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, who was killed in a military engagement against Stephen's forces in 1144, and her most loyal confederate, her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, who died nearing his 60th year in a relatively tranquil setting at Bristol Castle in the late autumn of 1147. All these factors ensured a cessation of fighting during these years. The subsequent period saw a fundamental transformation in the character of the war. By then, Matilda's eldest son, Henry Fitz-Empress, was entering what would now be considered his teenage years, but which in the medieval era were regarded as the initial years of adulthood. In such a scenario, he was increasingly presented as the potential future king if Matilda and her allies were successful in the conflict, with the possibility even that Matilda would govern jointly with her son. The conflict had escalated in the mid-1140s, with de Bohun even involving Pope Eugene III. Opting to minimize his losses, and with her son now assuming a more significant role in affairs, Matilda headed for France. He would spend most of the remaining years of the Civil War at Rouen in Normandy. The political landscape continued to evolve in the time that followed. A critical juncture arrived when Matilda's second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, died suddenly and unexpectedly at just 38 years of age in September 1151. A chronicle penned by John of Marmoutier claimed that Geoffrey had been attending a council of his nobles and advisors at Le Mans when he suddenly fell ill with a severe fever. His illness was rapid, and he died on the 7th of September. He was interred in St. Julian's Cathedral in Le Mans, where Matilda commissioned an effigy of him to be placed over his tomb. On this, his personal coat of arms, featuring a blue shield and gold lions, was displayed in one of the earliest examples of the use of a heraldic coat of arms in medieval Europe. It is noteworthy that Matilda commissioned this, and the coat of arms in question influenced the royal coat of arms of English monarchs in centuries to come. Geoffrey's death otherwise solidified Henry's position as the leader of the war effort on his mother's side, as he became Count of Anjou, now aged 18, and effectively Duke of Normandy as well. Already emerging as a shrewd military commander and political ruler, Henry, in concert with his mother, began engaging in diplomatic maneuvers in the early 1150s, whereby the papacy, the King of France, and the nobles of England were all courted to endorse Matilda and Henry's claim to the throne. Recognizing that diplomacy might achieve what war had failed to acquire over the preceding decade. On the opposing side, a contender was emerging to challenge Henry. Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, was a few years Henry's senior and was being presented to the English political elite by Stephen as his successor. This was even more pertinent on that side of the English Channel, as Stephen was over a decade older than Matilda, and his demise before his first cousin was probable. Thus, from Normandy in the early 1150s, Matilda was cognizant that the impending clash would determine whether Eustace or Henry would succeed Stephen. The days when he might claim the throne himself and rule in his own right, fulfilling his father's aspirations of many years earlier, were receding. Events culminated around the siege of Wallingford Castle in 1153, where Stephen aimed to defeat one of Matilda's major English allies, Brian Fitzcount. Henry campaigned against Stephen to thwart this. After a stalemate had been reached yet again that summer, an agreement was finalized, known variously as the Treaty of Wallingford and the Treaty of Winchester. Through this, Henry consented to cease his efforts to displace Stephen and accept him as the King of England, on the condition that upon Stephen's death, Henry would succeed him, not Eustace or any of Stephen's other sons. The Treaty of Wallingford seemingly brought the anarchy to a close after 15 years of civil strife and decades of tension over the succession. One might ponder Matilda's reaction in Normandy upon receiving news of the agreement her son had brokered. The settlement was perhaps not as robust as it initially appeared, though. In the subsequent months, Stephen embarked on a flurry of activity, rallying his allies and touring England. This leaves the suspicion that he was formulating plans to potentially repudiate the agreement and reignite the war once the timing was politically advantageous. However, just as the deaths of members of the royal family during the White Ship disaster in 1120 and of the aged King Henry Werther in 1135 had precipitated the anarchy, the deaths of two royals in quick succession terminated it in the mid-1150s. First, Eustace died unexpectedly in August 1153, and then Stephen passed away just over a year later in October 1154. With this, the anarchy concluded. Matilda emerged victorious, although the triumph was largely for her son, who swiftly secured control over the government of England after Stephen's death. He was crowned on the 19th of December 1154 as King Henry II at Westminster Abbey. Fittingly, during the ceremony, one of the crowns utilized was that which Matilda had brought back from his time married to Emperor Henry I in Germany 3 decades earlier, a symbolic declaration of how Henry's mother had preserved her lineage's claim to the throne since his youth in Central Europe as a young woman. With the demise of Stephen and the accession of his son as King Henry II, Matilda found himself for the first time in nearly 2 decades not engaged in a war to claim his birthright and implement his father's wishes. He had not become queen himself, but his eldest son, whom he had symbolically named after his grandfather had. Matilda was victorious, and he now entered a period of quasi-retirement. He did not reside in England, remaining instead in Normandy and spending the remainder of his life there. Although Henry was the Duke of Normandy, his mother acted as one of his senior representatives there. As the new king, unlike his great-grandfather and grandfather, William the Conqueror and Henry III primarily viewed himself as an English monarch rather than a French lord who also happened to be King of England. During these years, there was also a symbolic effort to acknowledge Matilda's status as the daughter of King Henry I. Consequently, despite his retirement in Normandy, we possess royal charters and other governmental records from the second half of the 1150s and into the 1160s that bear both Henry and Matilda's names and royal seals. A tacit recognition that although Henry was the king, he had only achieved this position through his mother stepping aside to allow him to succeed Stephen. During his later years in Normandy, Matilda became a significant patron of the church and religious orders in northern France. Notably, he was known for the favor he extended to the Augustinians. These constituted a religious order whose members lived monastic lives in accordance with the religious precepts of St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the eminent early church fathers. In 1059, agreements were reached concerning monastic life at the Lateran Synod, which paved the way for the emergence of the Augustinians as a religious order that challenged the supremacy of the Benedictines across Christendom in the 12th century. Matilda was a major benefactress to them in northern France, both during the Anarchy and especially during his semi-retirement, when funds could be allocated for this purpose rather than towards raising armies, although both the Benedictines and the Cistercians also benefited from his generosity. He bestowed funding upon the Abbey of Bec in Normandy, for instance, an institution he had supported for decades, and also upon Bordesley Abbey in Worcestershire in England. In all cases, there was an awareness of the political advantages of patronizing religious abbeys and houses that held a prominent role in local politics, something Matilda had recognized during his early years in Germany and had utilized as a political instrument for decades. His initial support of Bordesley, for example, dated back to the early 1140s when he cultivated relations there as a means of securing control over Worcestershire within the context of the Civil War. Setting aside this political maneuvering, there is no doubt that Matilda genuinely favored church reform and revitalization, and he continued in his later years to sponsor the church in Normandy and further afield. Matilda was far from politically inactive in the years following his son's accession as king. Although most of the relevant letters are lost, it is clear from chronicles and other supporting evidence that Matilda maintained extensive correspondence with his son during the second half of the 1150s and into the 1160s, with letters passing between Normandy and England as he advised him on many political matters. One topic on which he endeavored to counsel Henry concerned Thomas Becket, a prominent prelate and politician whom Henry appointed as Lord Chancellor of England shortly after his coronation. In 1162, Becket was elevated to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury within the church. This brought the previously loyal chancellor into conflict with Henry as the pair clashed over the rights and privileges of the church and the extent to which the archbishops of Canterbury were answerable solely to the Pope in Rome or also required the permission of the kings of England before acting on various issues. The dispute intensified throughout the 1160s. Matilda advised Henry to de-escalate the situation. He did not heed his advice, and ultimately in 1170, Becket was assassinated in Canterbury Cathedral. Although the degree to which Henry sanctioned the killing has been extensively debated ever since. He also advised Henry against launching a military expedition to Ireland in the 1150s to commence conquering the neighboring island from its many Irish lords. Perhaps he was correct. Henry did eventually authorize such a campaign after his mother died, initiating centuries of English involvement with Ireland. Matilda was in his 60s as his son's relationship with Becket began to worsen. He eventually lived to be 65 years old, a venerable age for that era. His later years saw him adopt a less prominent role in political affairs, no doubt enjoying the frequent visits of his grandchildren to Normandy, among whom would be two kings of England, King Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, and King John of Sur, two queens, Eleanor, Queen of Sicily, as well as several lords and ladies of other major polities. His son and grandsons would rule over territories in England, France, Wales, and even Ireland, which became known as the Angevin Empire in recognition of his marriage to Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, while the Plantagenet family name, which he had acquired through that same union, was borne by the rulers of England until 1485, when the House of Tudor ascended to power at the conclusion of the Wars of the Roses. Matilda died at home in Rouen in Normandy on the 10th of September 1167. He was buried at the Abbey of Bec, which he had supported for decades. His remains, however, were moved, lost, and rediscovered on several occasions over the centuries, ultimately finding their current resting place at Rouen Cathedral in the mid-19th century. At Bec, his tomb still carries the epitaph, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring, here lies Matilda, the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry." The Empress Matilda stands as one of the most extraordinary political figures of the High Middle Ages. During a long and diverse life, he became Holy Roman Empress, was involved in governing parts of Germany and Italy, while little more than a teenager, then became the Countess of Anjou in the late 1120s, before engaging in a significant civil war spanning nearly 2 decades to assert his right to become Queen of England in accordance with his late father's wishes. He demonstrated himself to be a formidable adversary, managing for a time in 1141 to seemingly defeat Stephen and claim his birthright, although the rout of Winchester and the subsequent release of his first cousin snatched defeat from the verge of victory. Admittedly, his unwavering determination to become Queen of England caused considerable suffering, with the country plunged into disarray, economic devastation, and conflict. But Matilda was not alone in his desire to terminate Stephen's reign. Ultimately, his persistence ensured that his cause endured sufficiently for his son to rise to prominence and resolve the fundamental issue that had initially sparked the war: the prospect of a female monarch. In the end, Matilda was not able to fully realize his father's plans for the succession, but the accession of his son as King Henry II in 1154 represented as favorable an alternative as could have been devised out of the chaos of the Anarchy.